Hello. If you're watching this video, I should just go ahead and tell you this is geared for the students that we have at the Tri-City School of Preaching. We have our lectureship coming up in April, and we're trying to get some preparation together for the lessons that will be presented there. We're talking about Jesus in the Old Testament. If you're watching this video on YouTube, you may want to jump over and watch it on my webpage. If you go to cadleonard.com, there you can find there's a tab at the top, something like lectures, I think it is. You'll want to find it in the lecture. Oh, we've got balloons going off, looks like. We've got the lectures tab, and then in the lectures tab, you'll be able to find, let's just call it sermon prep. And then once you go there, it will have the video. But underneath, I'll also have this document. And that's basically what I'm going to run through with you. And this maybe will help you get some ideas as to how to do your sermon prep. Okay, so let me go ahead and go through this with you. And I'll tell you, I'm going to try to be brief. That's a struggle for me. But hopefully after going through this document, you'll get some ideas as to maybe how to put together the lectureship sermon that you've been assigned. So let me tell you, we're going to first talk about our overall summary. I'm going to tell you what our focus is in preparing a lesson. Number 2, I'm going to talk to you about the procedure, how to go about preparing it. And then number 3, our final focus is going to kind of be part of the procedure as well. But we'll have 3 major things that we're going to look at. Let me go ahead and tell you what our overall summary is. Again, if you're not on the website or you don't have this document, get on the website, go to the lectures tab. They're on cadleonard.com, and you should be able to find the document once you go to the sermon prep section. It'll have the video and this document. If you don't have access to the document, you're watching this on YouTube, and you need the document, send me an email, and I'll happily send you the PDF for just this document. It'll help you follow along. Okay, our overall summary is this. Number 1, we have a primary focus. In preparing your lesson as a preacher/teacher, your primary focus involves all 3 of these things equally. Number 1, you need to be apparent or clear. You need to be extraordinarily clear so that when people walk away from your lesson, they know exactly what you were trying to get at, what you were trying to say. Number 2, just as equally important, and supporting the apparentness of your lesson, the clarity of your lesson, you need to have an arrangement. You need to put together some kind of structure, and this will add to the clarity of your lesson. And number 3, it needs to be applicable or practical. All 3 of those things are equally valuable. It needs to be apparent, it needs to be arranged, and it needs to be applicable. And so a question to ask, and we'll get into this as we start going through the procedure, but a question that you need to ask yourself as you're starting to gather data, something we'll talk about here in a moment, is, does this particular data, this information that I have and that I'm seeking to present to my audience, does it add to or does it take away from this trifold aim? If I tell you what a sack of corn cost in ancient Israel, does this help me with my clarity? Does it help with my outline? And is it in some way applicable? Maybe not. Unless there's a big point that we're trying to make out of this. Well, corn costs this, and therefore this leads us to this point, and this makes it, and then it becomes practical. Cut that business out. Some of this information, you only have 40 minutes time to present your lesson. Cut the fluff. Get that stuff that's irrelevant out of there and present the material. I'm not saying some of this is irrelevant. I'm saying you only have 40 minutes. Is that really the most relevant thing to talk about? All right, so we need to have our primary focus. If you get anything right about this lesson, get this right. Make sure that your lesson is clear, that it's arranged well, and that it's applicable. If you don't even touch the topic of Jesus in the Old Testament, at least get this bit right, okay? This is your primary focus, to leave your audience with a lesson that is clear enough to follow, that they can get something out of it, it's arranged well, and it makes them better people. It's applicable. If you don't do anything else with your lesson right, get that right and you'll do great. All right, the second focus then is this. You have a text assigned to you. One of you got 1st and 2nd Kings. One of you got 1st and 2nd Chronicles. I got Haggai and Zephaniah. Another one of us got Zechariah and Malachi. One got Esther and maybe Job. I can't remember all the topics. You get the point. And in some of these texts, we're having a hard time finding Jesus there. That's not a problem. We'll talk about it in point 3. I'm saying this. Your second focus, your first focus is just to have a good arrangement, clarity. You're supposed to make it applicable. That's your first focus. Your second focus is to know the text that you've been assigned. If you've been assigned the book of Genesis, you need to know Genesis. And you need to know about chapters 1 through 11 is the creation narrative along with the flood. You need to know that 12 through 25 is the block about Abraham. You need to know about the block about Jacob and Isaac. And you need to know about the final block about Joseph in 37 through 50. There's your 4 points, by the way. If you know the structuring of Genesis, there are your 4 points. And then at the end, you're going to cycle back at the point 5 to say, and here's our conclusion. Here's where we see Christ along the way. And you'll bring some of those points out at the very end. More on that in a moment. But I'm saying your second focus is to know the text of Genesis. So what does that mean? We'll talk about it here in a moment. Our final focus. This is our third focus then. Not until we've gotten our primary focus of clarity, arrangement, and applicability, practicality. Not until we've worked the text that's been assigned us, Genesis, Haggai, and Zephaniah. Not until we've done those 2 things, then do we bring in Jesus Christ. It's an Old Testament text, so Christ is going to come in at the end of the lesson, the climax of the lesson. He shouldn't be the major focus the whole way through. You're going to build to this point. And you're going to have to set it up well. But this is our third focus then, to bring Jesus Christ in. And we'll say how to do that perhaps at the end of this little video. So, I'm going to advise you to do this, not to make this assignment harder than it has to be. And it is tough. If you were to go at it to try to find Christ here and dig this out, you're not going to find it in some of these cases. So what we're going to have to do is come at it from a different way. And I'm saying let's bring Christ in at the close, probably the last 5 minutes of the lesson. But let's know the text that's been assigned to us, and let's set it up so that in the last 5 minutes of the lesson we can bring Christ in and maybe make it pop with a climactic tone to it. All right, so this brings us to our second thing that we're going to focus on, and that is the procedure. I've just given you an overall assessment of what we're going to do. We're going to talk about our primary focus, our secondary focus, and our final focus. Now, let's talk about point number 2 then, our procedure. What would this look like? The first thing you've got to do is work the text, and this is going to support that primary focus of arrangement, of applicability, of apparentness, clarity. All of that, that's equally important, is going to be supported by the data that you're going to bring out. So what data are you going to present? Well, if you're in Genesis, you're going to have the data from Genesis. If you're in Kings or Chronicles or Ezra or Nehemiah, you're going to bring out the data as provided by that text. Don't jump to the New Text and start talking about Jesus Christ yet. Your text is an Old Testament text. And so, let me tell you what I've done for last year's lectureship and what I am doing for this year's lectureship. Last year, I was assigned Galatians. In Galatians, Jesus is the supplier of every need. Ironically, the strand, he is the supplier of every need, is not even from Galatians. So you can imagine how difficult of an assignment that was. How am I supposed to present Jesus as the supplier of every need when that's not even a focus in Galatians? Here's what you do. You work the Galatians text. How do you do that? Let me tell you what I did. This is N.T. Wright's book on Galatians. Read the whole thing in preparation. I can't remember, 400 pages, something like that. You can see I've read the book. Read Wright on Galatians, about a 400-page book. Here's Richard Hayes. Didn't read this whole thing. I read the parts that matter, in my estimation. Had to skip the first, 100 pages or so. But you get the idea. Read this book, too. And Hayes is writing about the substructure of Galatians 3 and through 4. Read a little bit of Wright on the climax of the covenant. Yeah, there were some parts. This isn't all about Galatians, so I read the chapters that pertained. And then there's this New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, and there's maybe a big book, about 100, 200-page commentary on Galatians by Richard Hayes. Read all of that, I think, if I remember correctly. Read all of that in preparation for Galatians. Not until I've done my homework and gathered my data am I prepared to put my lesson together. You've got to have something to say. How do you know what to say? You're going to have to read. You are going to have to read. Now, I know you've got a lot on your plate this quarter. I know I've got a lot on my plate with the work that I do. But I'm saying this, you're going to have to read. Now, in preparation for my lesson this year in lectureship, I'm working with Zephaniah and Haggai. This is Jack Lewis on the Minor Prophets. Small little book. I'm reading his parts on Zephaniah and Haggai. Haven't read it yet, getting around to it. Haven't read this one yet either, but John Willis has a little part in here on Haggai. I'll get around to reading that soon enough. This is Haggai and Zechariah. Half of this book is about Haggai, which is my assignment. I've read about 50 of the 100 pages of this book. This is where I am. I've read about 50 of the 100 pages devoted to Haggai. It looks a little thin. It's more there than meets the eye. I've read the parts on Haggai and Zephaniah and John Goldengay's little thing on Daniel and the 12 prophets. I've read J.J.M. Roberts on Zephaniah. And last night, finished my reading on Zephaniah from The Transforming Word. The fellow who does the Zephaniah part here is John Willis. So I'm reading a couple of different fellows in preparation for Zephaniah and Haggai. What are you going to read? You need to find something to read. Not just the text. Now, you can't go wrong with just the Bible, but you can go even more right, more correctly, by reading people on the Bible. So you're reading the Bible, but you're also getting thoughts of people who've spent time in the text, whether it's Galatians, whether it's Haggai, Zephaniah, Genesis, Ezra, Esther, Isaiah, you name it, you need to be reading. And so your first step, before you ever start putting your lesson together, is you've got to gather data. All right, that's your first step. You got to hit the books. Now, once you've done that, the second thing you've got to do is start to siphon or filter your data. Not everything you read is going to be helpful. That's just part of it. You're going to have to compress and condense and take, whether you've read 4 books, 50 books, you're going to have to start condensing. Even if you've only read 1 book, you're going to have to start packing that information. You get 40 minutes. You get 40 minutes. So make it count. You're going to have to pick the data that's important and the data that's unimportant, and you're going to have to separate the two. You're going to have to siphon out what is good and what is not good. And once you've done that then, and you've found this is good material, I've made my notes in my books. You see, like, for instance, this is J.J.M. Roberts on Zephaniah. I've made my notes in my reading. I'm going to have to go back through all of these notes now and start to siphon through that material and say, doesn't need to be said. This does need to be said. This is a good point. This needs to be brought out. And I'm going to have to go back through all of that reading, filtering and siphoning out what is bad so that I can have the good left over. Once you have all the good left over, and you might have to make another sheet of notes, you grab a piece of paper and you start to write on it, this is good, this is good, this is good. You've got your sheet of what is your good material. Then what you need to do is get another piece of paper and start arranging it. All right, so I've got 50 really good points. Now, how do I pack all this in? And your points that you've gathered, of course, should be from the text, you understand? It's from Zephaniah 1. It's from Zephaniah 2. It's from Zephaniah 3. It's from Haggai 1. It's from Haggai 2. I've got 5 chapters. And so I'm going to have to start gathering that material and presenting it. The most logical way might be chronological. Maybe you're going to present your material in a thematic way. You're not going to worry so much about chronology. You've got 5 big points you want to say, or you've got 3 big points you want to say. And you're going to start to work the material into that outline, into that structuring. So you need to then start to arrange the good points that you've learned, that you've gathered by reading or listening to material or watching a video, you understand? And you're going to gather that data, you're going to siphon or filter the data, and then you're going to arrange the data. And you've got to start asking these kinds of questions as you start to work an arrangement. How many chapters do I have? In my case, I have 5. Maybe 5 points wouldn't be bad. 1 per chapter. Maybe you've got a book of the Bible that's got 30. But as you look at maybe a commentary, or you just spend some time in the text and you start to figure out there's an outline here. For instance, think about 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, the first little bit there's about Samuel, next little bit's about Saul, and the last little bit's about David. There's your 3-point sermon from Samuel. You know, Samuel, Saul, David. And you can come up with an alliteration that fits for those 3 characters. And that's your 3-point sermon. Well, 1 Samuel has 31 chapters. Is that right? 1 Samuel has 31 chapters, but you can get a 3-point sermon by looking at the structuring of the book. So maybe you've got to do that with your text. Look at a commentary. See the outlines that are in the introduction or the front of the book, and see if you can't find out an outline for your overall book. You're working the Old Testament text. We're not even close to prepared yet to talk about Jesus Christ until we know the Old Testament text that we're working with. That's right. That's exactly right. Now, once we've gathered, siphoned, and arranged, we've got to ask some questions. Are my points and subpoints then arranged coherently? Thematically, chronologically, how's my arrangement? And is the flow of my lesson logical? Let me show you on this document what I've done. In Galatians last year, I did the story, the situation, the solution, and the subtext. I haven't yet landed on the outline I'll use for Zephaniah and Haggai this year. But maybe I'd go with something like crisis, calamities, coming, and conclusion. Ultimately, I mean to say something about the exile situation behind Zephaniah. They went into the Assyrian Babylonian exile. The calamities, they experienced some natural disasters in the early bit of Haggai. And the coming was the hope that both Zephaniah and Haggai and all of the prophets looked to. And then I move close into fourth point, conclusion. The hope, of course, centered around the Jewish Messiah and God's working an ideal era, and more on that in a moment. Or maybe I'd go with the outline, maybe just 3 points here. The destruction, which would be, of course, the exile. The disasters, which, of course, would be the natural disasters in the early part of Haggai. And 3, the destiny, the anticipation, the hope that the Jews were holding out for. So maybe a 3-point sermon. Or I've got 5 chapters, like I said, in Haggai and Zephaniah together. 3 in Zephaniah, 2 in Haggai. Maybe I do a 5-point sermon. Take a point from each chapter and work it through that way. Only until we've worked the Old Testament text, listen to me carefully, only until you've worked the text that's been assigned to you, whether it's Galatians in the New Testament or it's Haggai and Zephaniah in the Old, only until you've worked that text are you then fit to tell us how Jesus somehow falls in line. So you need to work the Old Testament text first and foremost. That is your assignment. And it should support the primary focus. Your secondary focus is to work that text. But that text that you're working should enhance the primary focus, which, of course, are our 3 A's. A being it needs to be apparent or clear, it needs to be arranged well, and it needs to be applicable and practical for the people that we're speaking to. Now, with that in mind, the final point, and by the final point, I mean, balloons again. By the final point, I mean something like only in the last 5 minutes would I start talking about Jesus Christ in these texts of the Old Testament. Your job is to work the Old Testament text. And I'm saying that, now, unless you've got a text that's just too loaded with messianic overtones, like Isaiah or Zechariah or something like that, only unless I had that Old Testament text, I would say, here's what I'm saying, I would save the discussion about Christ in that text until the last 5 minutes and make that the climax. Unless it's a text that's just so obvious that it's easier to work. You get a text like Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job. I mean, you pick. You pick. Some of these prophetic... Zephaniah has literally nothing in there about Jesus Christ. So I would save the climax of the lesson, the last 5 minutes, to bring Christ in. Now, I'm not saying that we're bringing Christ in incorrectly, as if this is a faulty exegetical move. But I'm saying the primary focus of that text was written for an earlier Old Testament audience. It may not be so loaded with Jesus Christ as some of us would like it to be. So we need to work the context first. Save the discussion for Jesus in about the last 5 minutes of the lesson. Save it as your climactic conclusion that's practical and applicable. And that brings us to our third thing. If you have the sheet, of course, it brings us to our final consideration. This is our third or final focus. I think we would do well to conclude the lesson with about a 5-minute discussion on Christ and how he makes this stuff pop with application. Save your application, your big takeaway, your big final focus for the end of the lesson. You might make a couple of peripheral points along the way, application, practical points along the way, but save the big gun for the end is what I'm saying. This is your climax. This is the conclusion of the lesson. Now, how do we see Jesus in these texts? I've got about 4 ways here that I think we would do well, especially in some of these texts where we just aren't seeing him. I've got about 4 ways that stand at the back of the Old Testament, driving even these texts that don't have Jesus mentioned by name. They're not predictive. They're not even prophetic. I think we've got about 4 here. Number 1, the messianic hope. The Jews all held out for the messianic hope. I've got some passages there you would do well to look over, and in the conclusion of your lesson, bring out God was committed to the messianic hope. Even if we're not reading a text about it, it was still there at the back, driving the whole history of the Jews. More on that on point 3. Number 2, we would do well to remind ourselves that God's faithfulness to his initial promise to Abraham to bless all nations in the seed stood at the back. And so even when we're working with historical texts like Esther, where even God is not mentioned in the book, or even Jesus is not mentioned in the book, we are reminded that Esther is a part of the history that speaks of God's faithfulness to his covenantal promise. After all, what would have happened if the Jews had been exterminated in Esther's day? No seed line. After all, what would have happened if Hezekiah hadn't been healed of his illness and he had never given birth to Manasseh? Manasseh never came from his loins. He's in the seed line of Christ, Matthew 1. So even where it doesn't look like there's an overt, clear remark about Jesus, we still remind ourselves that God's faithfulness to his project is running through the Old Testament. Number 3, here's a third way to see the Messiah in these Old Testament texts, even where it doesn't look obvious. God's faithfulness in history. The Old Testament wholesale, Genesis through Malachi, in our English arrangement, as a whole package, speaks about God's faithfulness to the Messiah, in the Messiah, to the people of the whole world, in human history. Paul said something in 1 Corinthians 10:11. This is the end. This is the final chapter of human history. Upon us, he said, the ends of the earth, the ends of the ages have come. All of human history. That means Genesis's history. That means Esther's history. That means Ezra's history. That means Zephaniah's historical remarks. They all work forward to the final chapter, which rests on, that's right, Jesus Christ. Number 4, we find out that God has a tradition all along the way of the wicked and the righteous. The wicked, of course, he said in Matthew 23, Jesus did. He said, you stand in the tradition with your fathers. They were goons too, and they killed and raped and plundered. And Jesus said to them, you're bringing their blood right upon you. You stand in their tradition. On the other hand, Jesus stands in a tradition like the Hall of Faith of Hebrews 11. And that means the whole Old Testament, with all of those Old Testament heroes, the Old Testament history, the Old Testament kings, the Old Testament prophets, etc., 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 they all were pointing forward to Jesus Christ. So I think we've got about 4 ways, and I've got some text there too on number 4. I think we've got about 4 ways that it's easily seen that the whole Old Testament as a package works its way forward, anticipates the Messiah who turns out to be Jesus of Nazareth. God's faithfulness to his promise, the messianic hope, faithfulness to his history, God's faithful in history, and God is faithful to a tradition of righteousness. All of these imperfect models along the way point us to the perfect model, who is Jesus. Now, you can easily pick at the Old Testament. Zephaniah was a good guy, but he wasn't Jesus. Esther was a good girl, but she wasn't Jesus. Rahab was a bad girl. She wasn't Jesus. But then she was a good girl, wasn't she? She actually turned it around, and she stood in the righteous tradition. Abraham was a good guy, but he wasn't Jesus. Leonard might be a good man, but he's not Jesus. And all of these imperfect models in the Old Testament, and even us today, are imperfect models of the perfect image of God. Genesis 1, 26 and 27. And there's your application. At the end of it all, we see a contrast of everything in the Old Testament and what it pointed to in Jesus. There's a contrast of the imperfect in the Old Testament, but in Christ we see the perfect. And the whole Old Testament, no matter what book you've been assigned, stands in a history, stands in a tradition, stands in an anticipation of God's fulfilling his promise, which is, of course, brought to pass in Jesus of Nazareth. So if you're looking for help on how to prepare your lesson, maybe this will help. You seek not to go at it this way. I'm not saying this is the right way to do it, but maybe if you've been struggling, this will help you out in a way or two. Thanks for tuning in. We're so glad that you've watched the video. I hope it didn't go as long as, it looks like it's just approaching 25 minutes. I always go longer than I intend. But thanks for joining in. Hopefully you found this helpful in a way or two. If you're still struggling to prepare your lesson, sermon prep, lesson prep, reach out through email, text. Happy to help. God bless you.